this episode, we turn to organizational culture, which is one of the most important but least visible parts of Domain 1 and certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, see Risk. For a beginner, culture can sound vague at first, almost like a soft business topic that sits far away from risk, controls, and governance. But that is not how it works in real organizations. Culture affects whether people follow processes when nobody is watching, whether managers raise uncomfortable issues early, whether teams tell the truth about control weaknesses, and whether leaders reward discipline or only reward speed. That means culture is not a decorative topic sitting beside the real work. It is part of the environment that determines whether the organization's risk decisions actually hold up under pressure. A company can have written policies, assigned roles, and good technology, but if the culture quietly encourages shortcuts, silence, or blame, risk will often grow in the spaces between those formal structures. This is why culture matters so much in C Risk. It helps explain why two organizations can look similar on paper but perform very differently when stress, uncertainty, and competing priorities appear. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A simple way to understand culture is to think of it as the collection of shared habits, expectations, assumptions, and behaviors that shape how work really gets done. It includes what people believe matters, what they think leadership truly values, what kinds of mistakes are tolerated, and what behavior is rewarded even when nobody says it out loud. Culture is not limited to mission statements, posters, or speeches from executives. In fact, people usually understand culture more from everyday experiences than from formal words. They notice what happens when a deadline conflicts with a control requirement, when someone reports a problem that could embarrass a manager, or when a team asks for extra time to do something carefully instead of quickly. If the organization says one thing but rewards another, employees learn the real culture very quickly. That is why culture is so powerful in a risk context. It teaches people what will happen if they choose caution, honesty, escalation, or process discipline, and those lessons often shape behavior more strongly than any written policy ever could. One reason culture matters so much in risk management is that most important failures do not begin with a dramatic attack or an obvious act of misconduct. Many failures begin with smaller choices repeated over time. A team may skip a review because it seems unnecessary in a busy week. A manager may delay reporting a weakness because leadership is focused on growth. An employee may assume a control is optional because everyone around them treats it that way. None of those choices may feel disastrous in the moment, but together they create an environment where exposure grows quietly. A healthy culture makes those small moments more disciplined. It encourages people to think about consequences, to raise concerns earlier, and to respect the connection between process and business stability. An unhealthy culture makes the opposite more likely. It teaches people to stay quiet, avoid conflict, and focus on appearance rather than reality. That is why culture belongs in Domain 1. Before an organization can manage risk well, it needs an environment where people consistently support the behaviors that governance and control depend on. Leadership plays a huge role in shaping culture because employees pay close attention to what leaders do, not just what they say. If leadership talks about accountability but ignores repeated exceptions when a high-performing team wants special treatment, the message is clear. If leaders say that risk reporting matters but react defensively whenever bad news arrives, people will learn to soften or delay the truth. In contrast, when leaders respond calmly to concerns, ask serious questions about business impact, and treat control discipline as part of responsible performance, that behavior teaches the rest of the organization what is expected. This does not mean senior leaders have to personally manage every control or investigate every issue. It means their visible priorities shape the emotional and operational tone of the business. A culture becomes stronger when leadership is consistent about what matters, especially when difficult trade-offs appear. For C-Risk learners, this is important because it shows that governance and culture are deeply connected. Governance may define expectations formally, But leadership behavior tells employees whether those expectations are real or merely decorative. Another major influence on culture is incentives, because people tend to move toward what the organization rewards and away from what it punishes. If employees are evaluated only on speed, revenue, or project completion, then controlled discipline may weaken even if the company says security is important. If managers know they will be criticized for raising delays but praised for pushing work through, they may quietly encourage shortcuts. This does not always happen through bad intentions. Sometimes the incentive structure simply pulls people toward the wrong behavior without anyone openly acknowledging the conflict. A mature organization tries to align performance expectations with responsible risk behavior. It recognizes people not only for achieving business results, but for achieving those results in a way that respects process, control, and accountability. That is one reason cultural problems can be difficult to solve by training alone. If the everyday reward system teaches people that control compliance slows careers or causes friction, then awareness sessions will have limited effect. In C-risk terms, culture becomes healthier when incentives support the same direction that governance, policy, and leadership are trying to establish. Communication is another powerful cultural signal because it shows whether the organization is truly open to hearing difficult information. In a strong culture, people know that reporting a weakness, asking a hard question, or escalating a concern will be taken seriously rather than treated as disloyalty or inconvenience. That does not mean every report will lead to a dramatic response, but it does mean people believe the organization wants a realistic view of exposure. In a weak culture, communication becomes filtered. Teams may hide uncertainty, dress up status reports, or wait until a problem becomes too large to ignore before mentioning it. This is incredibly dangerous in risk management because time matters. Early awareness often creates options, while delayed awareness can force rushed decisions under pressure. A healthy culture encourages speaking up before an issue becomes a crisis. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest ways to understand culture in practical terms. It is not only about whether people seem friendly or motivated. It is about whether the organization creates enough trust and seriousness that important risk information can travel upward before the damage becomes much harder to contain. This also helps explain why policies and standards, by themselves, are never enough. An organization can write excellent documents, assign them official approval, and distribute them across the company, yet still fail if the culture does not support the behavior those documents require. If employees believe the policy exists only for auditors, they may ignore it whenever deadlines tighten. If managers treat standards as negotiable suggestions unless someone complains, the written framework loses authority in practice. Culture is what turns rules into habits or leaves them as paper. That does not mean documentation is unimportant. Clear policy direction is a vital part of governance. But C-Risk wants you to understand that documentation only works when the surrounding culture reinforces it. A culture that values honesty, consistency, and accountability makes policies easier to apply because people see them as part of responsible work. A culture that values appearance, convenience, or exceptional treatment for powerful teams makes policies harder to enforce because everyone starts learning that formal expectations are secondary to unwritten exceptions. One of the most common cultural tensions inside organizations is the tension between speed and control. Businesses often need to move quickly in order to compete, respond to customers, and meet financial goals. At the same time, they need discipline if they want change, data handling, vendor management, and daily operations to remain stable and trustworthy. A mature culture does not pretend this tension disappears. Instead, it teaches people how to navigate it honestly. Teams understand that speed matters, but they also understand that not every shortcut is harmless and not every delay is wasteful. A weak culture often frames controls as obstacles created by people who do not understand the business. A stronger culture frames controls as part of how the business protects its ability to move forward without creating hidden damage. This distinction matters because many organizations fail when they convince themselves that discipline is the enemy of performance. C-Risk encourages the learner to reject that false choice. Healthy culture does not destroy speed. It helps the organization move with enough awareness and structure that success remains sustainable rather than fragile. Another important point is that organizations rarely have one completely uniform culture. They often contain subcultures across departments, regions, leadership teams, and professional functions. A finance group may be highly process-driven, while a product team may value experimentation and rapid change. A headquarters office may feel very different from a remote location or an acquired business unit. These differences matter because risk behavior often changes from one part of the organization to another. A policy may be respected in one function and loosely interpreted in another. Reporting may be immediate in one region and hesitant in another because local leadership responds differently to bad news. For a beginner, this is useful because it prevents an overly simple view of culture. Culture is not always a single company personality that touches everyone in the same way. It can vary depending on local incentives, management behavior, history, and business pressure. That is why leaders and risk professionals need to pay attention not only to what the enterprise says about itself, but also to how different parts of the organization actually behave when real decisions, deadlines, and control challenges appear. Culture becomes especially visible during stress because pressure tends to reveal what the organization truly values. During a major system outage, an urgent product launch, an audit concern, or a vendor issue, people often fall back on their deepest learned habits. If the culture is healthy, teams are more likely to communicate clearly, respect escalation paths, document decisions, and balance urgency with accountability. If the culture is weak, people may bypass approvals, hide uncertainty, point fingers, or make unsupported decisions simply to reduce immediate pressure. This is why some organizations perform much better than others during incidents, even when their formal resources look similar. The difference is not always the tool set. Sometimes it is the cultural muscle memory that tells people how to behave when the usual routine breaks. C-Risk includes culture because risk management must work under stress, not only during calm planning. A culture that supports truth, teamwork, and disciplined action becomes a form of resilience. A culture built on fear, status, or denial often becomes a hidden vulnerability that grows more dangerous at exactly the moment the organization most needs clarity. New employees and third parties also interact with culture in important ways. When someone joins the organization, they quickly begin learning what behavior is truly expected by watching how meetings are handled, how exceptions are discussed, and how leaders respond to risk information. The same is true for contractors, vendors, and partners who work closely with the business. They do not absorb culture through a single orientation message. They absorb it through repeated experiences. If they see controls taken seriously, concerns discussed openly, and accountability applied fairly, they adjust accordingly. If they see people rewarded for cutting corners or avoiding difficult conversations, they learn that pattern instead. This matters because risk is often introduced or amplified through change, onboarding, handoffs, and external relationships. A healthy culture helps new participants understand that business success and responsible behavior belong together. A weak culture leaves them guessing, and people who are guessing will often follow the most convenient local norm rather than the official enterprise expectation. That is why cultural consistency matters so much. It helps people enter the environment and understand what the organization really stands for in practice. Because culture is less visible than a process document or a technical control, organizations have to be thoughtful about how they assess it. They cannot simply assume culture is healthy because there have been few visible incidents or because leadership speaks positively about values. Signs of culture show up in patterns. Frequent exceptions, repeated policy workarounds, delayed reporting, high turnover in sensitive functions, inconsistent management behavior, surprise failures, and weak follow-through on known issues can all suggest deeper cultural problems. On the positive side, early escalation, honest discussion of control gaps, steady remediation, and consistent respect for process often suggest stronger cultural support for governance. None of these indicators should be interpreted blindly, but they help leadership ask better questions. For C-Risk learners, this is important because it reminds you that culture can be examined through evidence, not only through intuition. While culture may sound soft, its effects are often visible in control performance, issue patterns, reporting quality, and the organization's overall willingness to confront uncomfortable truths before they turn into larger business problems. Improving culture usually requires more than a motivational message or another awareness campaign. Real improvement happens when leadership behavior, incentives, communication practices, and control expectations begin reinforcing one another in a more consistent way. If the organization wants employees to report concerns early, leaders have to respond in a way that makes early reporting worthwhile. If it wants managers to respect standards, then managers should not be rewarded for bypassing them in the name of convenience. If it wants teams to view controlled discipline as part of strong performance, that message has to appear in planning, review, escalation, and decision-making, not just in training slides. This is why culture work can take time. It involves changing the repeated lessons people receive from the environment around them. A beginner should remember that better culture does not always mean a friendlier culture or a more relaxed culture. Sometimes it means a more serious, more transparent, and more accountable environment where people understand that responsible behavior is part of how the organization succeeds, not something added on after the real work is done. A common misconception is that culture is mainly about employee morale or general workplace atmosphere. Those things matter in their own ways, but in the context of C-Risk, culture is more specifically about the shared norms that shape decision-making, accountability, control behavior, and communication around risk. An organization can seem energetic, creative, and even enjoyable to work in while still having a poor risk culture if people avoid escalation, ignore process discipline, or treat governance as a barrier to be worked around. On the other hand, an organization can feel formal or demanding while still having a strong culture if employees know the rules are applied fairly, concerns can be raised safely, and leadership takes business risk seriously. This distinction matters because it keeps the learner focused on the purpose of culture inside governance. The question is not whether people like the company. The question is whether the company creates consistent behavior that supports responsible decisions under normal conditions and under pressure. That is the lens C-Risk wants you to use, and it is much more practical than broad, vague talk about company personality. By the time you step back from this topic, the main lesson should feel clear and important. Organizational culture is not a side issue floating around the edges of governance. It is one of the forces that determines whether governance becomes reality or remains only a formal design on paper. Culture shapes how people interpret policies, how quickly they report problems, how they behave under pressure, and whether they believe controlled discipline is part of good business performance or an obstacle to it. It is taught through leadership behavior, incentives, communication patterns, and daily examples more than through slogans or value statements. That is why C-Risk places culture inside Domain 1, where the certification is building the environment in which risk decisions will later be made. If the environment teaches honesty, accountability, and disciplined action, risk management becomes much stronger. If the environment teaches silence, shortcuts, and image protection, even good frameworks can fail when they are needed most. Understanding that connection is one of the most valuable things a new learner can carry forward into every topic that comes next.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.